Hi everyone, it's Sarah from Oakland County Parks and Recreation's Nature Education Team. Each week we're releasing a video, craft, and activity on a different nature topic. Today I'm here to talk about invasive species, but not just any invasive species. We're going to talk about invasive species that you might find in your own backyard. Let's go investigate. So before we talk about invasive species that you might find in your yard, we should determine what exactly an invasive species is. An invasive species is a living organism that is brought from another area of the world, or sometimes even the region, and it causes harm either to the economy, to the environment, or to human health of the region that it's brought to. Let's talk about how you might be able to find some invasive species in your very own backyard. For example, under this shrub, you might see this benign looking plant, but guess what? It's invasive garlic mustard.
No.
This plant can actually spread to natural areas and smother all of our native plants that might be growing early in the season especially. This is a first-year garlic mustard. It's got these kind of wavy edges, almost kind of heart-shaped. The second-year plant is going to have taller stalks with white four-petaled flowers, and then it's going to form these seed pods. The seeds can actually persist for 7 years in the ground, so if you got it in your yard, it might be there for a while, and so you got to keep pulling it out as you go. Let's see what else we can find in this yard. Aha! Another invasive species growing right out of a crack next to my brother's house. This is Japanese knotweed. When it's full grown, it actually looks a whole lot like bamboo, and it can grow up to 10 to 12 feet tall, so it can get pretty big. Now, with it being in a crack like this, it might not get quite that large. They have these beautiful reddish stems, and sometimes the leaves do have some spotting on them. They tend to grow in sort of a zigzag pattern on the upper branches. Obviously, this is small, so it's all kind of like the upper branch. The leaves are kind of spade-shaped with a pointed end there. And when they get larger, there will be a huge stalk that's actually dappled kind of with this maroon color. There are actually some areas of the world where if they find this near your house during your home inspection, they will not insure your house because the roots are so powerful they will actually crack up the foundation. So no one wants that near their house. Better tell my brother to get rid of this, buddy. Look at this, a whole row of invasive species. It's almost as though they were intentionally planted here. And guess what? They were. A lot of invasive species start as plants that people have planted in their yards for landscaping purposes, but the issue with that is that they can then spread to our natural areas and create mass destruction. So here's a shrub that's commonly planted in yards for landscaping purposes. This is called burning bush, and it's named so because in the fall it turns this beautiful reddish pinkish color, so looking like a giant flame in your yard. And that's actually why it was brought here. It was brought here in the 1860s from Asia, so Japan, Korea, that area, and it was introduced to people's houses because it was this exotic, ornamental, beautiful plant. So let's talk about some identifying characteristics so you can tell if you have burning bush in your yard. If we take a look at the leaves, they are pointed, somewhat oval shaped. They have these little teethy sort of ridges on them. It almost reminds me of like a holly leaf. And the stems have sometimes these little extensions of wood on them. They kind of look like little wings. As the plant gets older and the bark matures, it gets to more of this smooth grayish bark, but you'll see some green in there as well. So the leaves are arranged in an opposite pattern, meaning one is coming right across from the other, sort of like your arms. And they can grow up to 20 feet tall, so it can be a pretty decent sized shrub. And the reason that these are bad for the environment is because they produce these beautiful pink berries that are then eaten by birds and carried to our natural areas where they spread the seeds prolifically, and so you'll have just a stand of burning bush where you may have had multiple native plants in the past. Another shrub you may have in your yard is a honeysuckle shrub. There are multiple species of honeysuckle that are invasive. We have actually two different species right next to each other here. I believe this is Maro's honeysuckle and Amur honeysuckle. They were both brought here to the United States from the Asian area for landscaping, hedgerows, and also wildlife habitat. They grow these beautiful reddish, pinkish berries in the fall, depending on the species, that birds love to eat. The issue with those berries is that they're super high in sugar and don't have a whole lot of good fat for the birds. So as the birds are migrating, it's almost like they're stopping at the candy shop to fuel up instead of going and having a good burger to give them some energy to fly south. When you're identifying your honeysuckle shrub, first you want to look at the leaves. See if the leaves are oppositely branched. Again, one coming directly out opposite the other. Some of the honeysuckle leaves, depending on the species, are going to have a very defined point to them. Some of them are going to be a little bit more rounded on the edge. You can see this one's a little bit more rounded. The berries grow out of the leaf axils, which is the location where the leaf connects to the stem of the plant. You can see them all along the stem here, and that's because that's where the flowers are growing as well. One characteristic of honeysuckle is that it often has these hollow stems. So the pith, which is the inner part of the wood, is very soft, and over time as the plant ages it will kind of disintegrate. Another thing to look for is the pinstriped pattern on the bark. Another interesting thing about honeysuckle shrubs, they were brought here for wildlife purposes, right, to give some habitat structure and maybe provide some shelter for the birds. But interestingly enough, it was found that the honeysuckle shape is so consistent in its growing pattern that predators are actually able to determine where the bird nests are most likely to be just because of how uniform they tend to grow. And if we look at the shape, you see how the branches tend to kind of arch over almost like an umbrella.
It looks like an umbrella!
So these plants can be really bad in natural areas because of these arching branches that cause all of this shade underneath, and it smothers out our native plants because they're not able to get sunlight. One other characteristic of invasive plants that also gives them a growing advantage over some of our native species is that they tend to leaf out, so their leaves open up much earlier in the spring and they remain on the plant long into the fall after many of our native species have already lost their leaves, meaning they're able to photosynthesize and create more energy for themselves longer than our native species, so they're able to grow faster and more abundantly. Another shrub you may have in your yard is Japanese barberry. Unlike some of the other shrubs we talked about, this one really only gets about 3 to 4 feet tall. It was again brought here to the United States for ornamental yard growing purposes. It's got these egg-shaped or spoon-shaped leaves that grow in whorls, kind of in an alternate pattern down the stem. It also has these really sharp thorns that you definitely wouldn't want to brush against while you're cutting your grass or something like that.
Ow, these are sharp.
It also grows these little berries, which you can tell these are last year's berries. The new berries are going to be like a bright red color, but they're egg-shaped and kind of waxy looking. They're eaten by deer, grouse, turkey, and other wildlife, and so that's how they're spread throughout our natural areas. Here's another example of Japanese barberry. Another interesting fact about this species is that it actually creates a microclimate within its branches where it's actually trapping humidity, which actually creates a very good habitat for black-legged ticks, which you may be familiar with. They spread Lyme disease. So if you have a lot of these in natural areas, or maybe even in your yard, you may have an abundance of ticks, and that's another great reason to remove them. Also in natural areas, they do tend to crowd out our native species, so they're reducing the biodiversity of our native plants. The last invasive shrub we're going to talk about today that you might have in your yard is buckthorn. So here's how to identify buckthorn. First of all, take a look at the leaves. They tend to be fairly oval shaped. They might have a little point at the end, and the veins start at the base of the leaf and they curve down toward the tip of the leaf. So you can see they're not going straight across the leaf to the edge, they're all kind of curving toward the tip. Another thing to look for are these little thorns on the end of the twigs here. They can also be found sometimes where the branches intersect other branches, and the buck part of the name comes from these little buds because someone thought they looked like a deer's hoof. The buckthorn bark tends to be a grayish color, and it's got these little white spots on it. Those are called lenticels. All woody stemmed plants do have them. They actually help with gas exchange inside the trunk of the tree, but they're not always visible. So on buckthorn, they're very obvious, similar to like a cherry tree. If you've seen a young cherry tree, the lenticels are very obvious too. You can also see as it gets older, it will be sort of a larger trunk down here that can then branch into multiple trunks as the shrub grows up. One other identifying characteristic of buckthorn are its berries. So these are young berries. They start off green. They come from kind of yellowish, creamy colored flowers that were blooming about a month ago. And as they mature, they're going to turn into this kind of shiny, blackish blue dark color that the birds love to eat. Now, one sneaky strategy of the buckthorn in terms of propagating itself is the fact that its berries are a diuretic, which means that
These will make you poop.
if animals eat the berries, it encourages them to use the bathroom, thus spreading its seeds across natural areas where the plant then grows and again can take up resources from our native species. The problem with invasive species is that they can consume all the resources that our native species need. This plant can also do more. It can disrupt the hydrology of the area because it takes in so much water. So if these are around vernal ponds a whole lot, it can actually disrupt the vernal pond and can over time really degrade that habitat. Another thing that it does is it disrupts the nutrient cycling in the soil because it takes in so much nitrogen. So that inhibits a lot of other plant growth just because there's not enough nitrogen in the soil for those plants. So again, it's beautiful in your yard, but when it gets into natural areas, it's bad news bears. Thanks for joining me today to learn about invasive species in your backyard. Feel free to leave any experiences or photos in our comments below. Check out our social media for other upcoming activities, and check out our website for nature center hours, park hours, other amenities, and upcoming programs. Stay safe, get outside, and we'll see you next time. Bye!